Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about analyzing and reporting data from a qualitative standpoint. I'm having a lot of technical difficulties and I called the IT people to come over and fix my computer in my office, and it seems that it has more problems now than before they came. So I look like I'm a giant face right now because I'm doing this on my laptop. So hopefully they'll be able to come in and fix my computer sometime soon. So sorry about the way that this might appear, and sometimes when I'm on my laptop the slides get a little cut off at the bottom, so please bear with me as we go through this. Alright, so we're going to learn about the major steps for qualitative data analysis, how we assure quality, the advantages of, they call them CACTA, computer assisted. I would have to say the advantages are very limited, but we'll talk more in depth about that. We'll talk about qualitative approaches to interpreting and analyzing, the inductive processes, the key differences between qualitative and quantitative in terms of data analysis, the major steps in the process, and how to disseminate your qualitative information. And as we all look forward to doing the qualitative assignment, this information should help you guys. Alright, so we're going to talk about contemporary tools for managing and analyzing qualitative data. And really there are a bunch of steps that we have to do in qualitative data to make sure that what we're doing is trustworthy, that when people read it they don't think, what is this hooey? We want to have a good foundation, a good structural background, and what helps us with that is having our methodology be strong and sound, and making sure we're putting into effect ways to assure trustworthiness, which we talked about in the last video. Those things like member checking, triangulation, making sure that your audit trail is really good. Those things are all going to apply here when we're talking about analyzing qualitative data. We're going to talk about low technology and high technology approaches, and I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but a lot of people in qualitative use more of a, we'll call it more of a low technology approach. And when I say low technology, that doesn't mean that computers aren't involved, because obviously if I'm transcribing data and doing stuff like that, I'm going to be doing stuff on my computer. So, but the analysis is coming out of my head. So I'm doing it on my computer, but I have to really think about it. And I'm going to be doing a lot of handwriting because that's how I process. And maybe that's not how you process. Some of you were sending me notes about, could you do your field notes in the notepad on your telephones? Well, in your day and age, everybody does all their note taking on the notepads in their telephone. So that doesn't bother me as long as you can screenshot it and send me those notepads. But back in the olden days, when dinosaurs roamed the earth and people like me were doing analysis, I still like to handwrite when I'm coding and writing memos and stuff in my qualitative analysis, because that to me is the quickest and easiest way for me to do it. And then I'll go back in and put stuff into the computer so that I can make sense of it and have a good electronic record. But I do like to write a lot of stuff, and that's where you'll see low tech. Anytime you're handwriting on things, it's low tech. But we have high tech systems, which are your computerized CACTA kind of systems that will run. They say they run data analysis for you. They really don't. It really requires a lot of manual entry stuff. So those are all things that you're going to want to think about. And of course the ways that you're going to enhance that quality, like we were just talking about, the triangulation, member checking, good audit trails, multiple reviewers or raters, those types of things. Alright, so what is qualitative data analysis? Well, it's got a broad range of approaches. It can be accomplished by an individual researcher. For example, I have a study on perceptions of disability in Nigeria, West Africa. For that study, I did the whole thing on my own. I had, because of the number of dialects in Nigeria, I had, my husband was actually serving as a translator for some of my participants who didn't speak any of the languages that I can speak. But other than that, everything was on my own. And so I was going through the analysis all by myself, and I was thinking about things, but it was nice that I had my husband and I could kind of run some ideas off of him. it's really nice when you're working on a qualitative piece. I have another qualitative study that I was working on where I had some members of the OT faculty and we were working together. There were 4 of us. And we really got to bounce some ideas off each other, and that worked extremely well because after we did some coding and everybody looked through the data, when we came back as a group, we found that we had definitely different interpretations of what had happened. So by sitting and talking with each other, we really made a much better sense of the data that came in. And then when we were done and we had, created our interpretation based on, it was a lot of, give and take. We talked in the last video about the peer debriefing where there might be some, arguments and disagreements, and then you finally come to agreements in the triangle. So yeah, we had some disagreements, and we really worked through those. And then when all that was said and done, and we had come to an understanding of how we felt it really worked, the data was working, then we did some member checking, and we were calling people that were in the group to ask them if that's how they perceived things, or these were the themes that they would have come up with. So you can do it as an individual researcher or as a team. And as I indicated, a team is sometimes nicer, and it's a good way to add to the credibility of your study, because you've got, the saying, 2 heads is better than 1. All right, so again, you can utilize a low-tech or a high-tech, and really qualitative data analysis. Remember, we talked about all those different epistemologies. We talked about phenomenology, we talked about ethnography, we talked about critical theory and participatory action research and grounded theory, and we talked about a whole bunch of different epistemologies. There's a billion more. When you're doing your data analysis, you'll see that it's reflected in the analysis. So, all right, we need to, when we're doing qualitative, there really has to be a strong consideration of, particularly, and I can't stress this enough, the amount of time that it takes to do this. This process is lengthy. I've said this before in other lectures. I said in quantitative, remember we're talking about quantitative, we're talking about numbers. The front end of those quantitative studies are harder because you have to be extremely specific in how you lay out the study that you're going to do in order to get your numbers to be right for any kind of statistical reliability or statistical validity. But then once you do all that in a quantitative study and you get to the back end, you just run it through the computer, bing, bam, boom, it's done. It's quick and easy on the back end. Well, the qualitative is exactly the opposite. So in the front end, it's real easy, because the front of a qualitative study, you really can't be that specific because you don't know what's going to happen. So you leave things more open. And a methods for a qualitative study could be as simple, when you're talking about where you're going to conduct the interview, at a mutually agreed upon place that is convenient for the participant. There's your setting. In a quantitative study, your setting would be much longer than that because you'd really explain what the setting was. You wouldn't be so vague. But in qualitative, you can get away with that vagueness in the beginning because you really don't have enough information to really be specific. And remember that we're being inductive, so our way of thinking is different in qualitative. So anyways, on the front end of qualitative, when you're writing a proposal, you end up with a really easy front end. I could write a qualitative proposal, like bing, bang, boom, would be done. But then when you start to gather the data and you start to, you're going through this iterative process of bringing in data, then changing your interview, and then recalling people, and then blah, 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 and you're going through this process, it becomes very long and very time consuming on the back end. Because everything you do, all of your interviews, those all have to be transcribed verbatim, and that takes forever. If you don't have a transcriptionist and you're doing it yourself, depending on your typing skills, that can take hours upon hours upon hours. For every hour of interview, you could be looking at 3 to 5 hours of transcription. It does, so those add up, and then In qualitative, it's not just a process where I put it in a computer and it spits out the answers. In qualitative, every interview I do, I have to go through, read, analyze, code, go through, read, analyze, code, go back, ask it, now I get the next one. I go through, analyze, code, read, go through, that is a time-consuming process. And even the write-up, a qualitative study, if I were to write a qualitative dissertation, a good one, I might be looking at 300 pages. If I'm writing a quantitative dissertation, which I did, I could be looking at, 100 pages. So just the back end of the write-up of a qualitative study is much larger because you're using that thick description and you're really getting into it. So those are totally different animals. So you really need to consider the time that it's going to take. And of course, how much is it going to cost you in analysis? I mean, if you're dedicating your life to this research and you're not getting paid, but you're putting in 80 hours a week, that's taking away from other things. And maybe you need to get a better job or a different job, something that pays you better. You need to think about how much funds you have to allocate to be able to do this effectively. So, you need to think about the volume and the structure of the data, just the sheer volume. You could have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pages of transcripted data. It depends on how many subjects you have, how long your interviews were, how much observation you did, how long your field works were. So you end up with just these piles and piles and piles of data, just in sheer volume. All right, so then you have to think about whether or not you're comfortable using whatever software might be available. If you end up doing the computer-assisted CACTA, they call it, and we'll talk more about that, then you need to be willing to kind of step out on a limb. Now, that's not to say that in quantitative you wouldn't have that same issue. I know that I keep saying I tend to use SPSS, and I don't know if I elaborated on what SPSS was when I do quantitative analysis. SPSS is called the Statistical Package for Social Sciences, SPSS. It's a computerized data analysis, quantitative data analysis package that really, any stats you want to run on anything, you could do it through SPSS. So it's very robust. It is well used. In fact, if you were at DuVille College and you're running stats, you are running SPSS. That's what we use at this college. So while I am familiar with SPSS, other people may not be familiar. Just as where some people are really super familiar with Excel stats, which tend to not be quite as robust, other people have no clue. So excuse me, for example, I am on a committee and we're looking at the general student learning outcomes at DuVille College. And we have a person who's supposed to be like the master of assessment is running the committee, which is fine. Good for you, master of assessment. But anyways, he put together, so we gathered in all these data, excuse me, from all these different teachers. And he input all this data into Excel and ran basically pivot tables, which you guys are all familiar with at this point, and created graphs. And when he showed them to the committee and actually to the faculty, people were just amazed at how wonderful these images were and these tables. They were so fantastic, and how could he possibly do it? And I'm sitting at the table thinking, are you serious? It probably took him like 5 minutes in Excel to do this. My level of comfort with Excel, which isn't really super great, is much higher than a lot of other people's level of comfort with Excel. My level of comfort with SPSS is much higher than a lot of people's comfort with SPSS. But my level of comfort with whatever program that they're using these days for qualitative analysis, I don't have any level of comfort with it because I don't use it. So if you're going to pull up a new technology, a new technical package to analyze data, you've got to be willing to put yourself out there and learn how to use that software. Or maybe don't use it. So those are your options. And you're not always going to have a teacher right here who can tell you, do this, do this, do this. Sometimes you got to figure this stuff out on your own. I know that when I was doing my dissertation, I was using SPSS. I thought I was being clever because my chair for my dissertation was a statistician. So I thought, by selecting him, I thought I was being very clever, that I had helped myself because he was a statistician, so he could help me with stats, right? Nobody's like super comfortable with stats, especially at that point in my career. I wasn't super comfortable. So I would go to him and ask him, you know, how do you do this? Blah, blah, blah. And I would ask whatever it was. And I remember him looking at me and saying, "You're a smart girl, Amy. You can figure this out." And that was literally all the help he gave me in my dissertation. So you won't always have somebody that's there that's going to help you, talk you through these statistical packages or this qualitative data analysis package. That's something that you're going to have to take the lead on and figure it out for yourself. So that's something you want to take into consideration. And then of course we want to know what the epistemology is. What is our thinking about thinking, and what is our thinking about how knowledge is gained? Are we ethnographers? Are we critical action researchers? What are we? So that is also going to impact. All right, so our qualitative data sources, they're going to have, we might have lengthy narratives, but kind of loosely structured. Maybe we did a unstructured interview, maybe we did a semi-structured interview, but it's not, whenever you're sitting down talking to people, there's no expectation for what exactly will come out of their mouths. So you don't know where an interview is going to go, and maybe it went off on a tangent and went off in a totally different direction and meandered out there for a little while and then got drawn back in. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about like a loosely structured, lengthy narrative. And when you transcribe that interview, it was 300 pages long. So you don't know. Sometimes you have short answer responses to an open-ended survey question. Some people write one word, yeah, no. Some people blather on forever. You could have field notes that are taken by participant observers. And remember, as a qualitative researcher, what are you doing? Always taking field notes, no matter what. Field notes are always a part of what you're doing. You might have audio or video recordings of events, and this is your data. You might have videotaped it, and that's what you've got. And now you've got to transcribe all that. You might have some secondary data. Maybe you got de-identified files from a hospital, and you're reviewing people's charts from the hospital. Or you got de-identified information from a school, and you're reviewing those kiddos' files. So those are all things you could have. You could have, they say brochures, minutes of meetings, it depends. Whatever the document is, the secondary data document, where somebody else got that information, now you're perusing it, you're going through it. That's a source of your data for your new study. So what are the common features? I keep saying this over and over. Get this word into your head. Iterative. Qualitative research is an iterative process. You collect data. You perform analysis as soon as you collect it. Remember what I said last time. You collect that data. You go home and look at it right away. You don't let it sit for a week and then go back to it. No. You go home. You look at it right away. You add to your field notes anything that you weren't able to jot down quickly while you were there. And then you do a quick analysis, and this analysis that you do, okay, so you do one interview or you do one observation and you do like a quick in the moment kind of analysis. That's not the end analysis, but that's to see where you're going, see what themes might be coming up, see if something came up that you want to follow up on, those types of things. And then maybe you're going to modify what your data collection tool was, your semi-structured interview, your structured interview, whatever it was. Maybe you're going to modify that and look in this new direction that you found from that first interview. So you're going to recollect data and you're going to keep doing this. It's going to keep going back and forth. In qualitative, you never just collect data I'm going to collect data for 3 months, and then at the end of those 3 months, I'll look at the data. No, it doesn't work that way. You collect data, you look at it, you collect data, you look at it, you analyze it, you collect it, you look at it, you analyze it, you collect it, you look at it, and it goes back and forth, around and around and around in a circle. And then also we want to think about that audit trail. The audit trail, like I told you, step by step, exactly what you did, so that anybody coming up behind you could replicate your study to the best of their ability. So your audit trail is going to allow for the tracking of the fluid, nonlinear nature of the process. So in your audit trail, it's going to say, collected data on first interview, analyzed data, findings revealed, blah, 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 modified interview guide, recalled first interviewee, interviewed second person, whatever steps it is that you took, those will all be in your audit trail. All right, so what does qualitative analysis create? It creates what we call metadata. And this is where things start to, metacognition is thinking about your thinking. Metadata is data about data. So what happens is you're collecting data, and those datas come in and you transcribe them, whether they be from observation or from narrative. You transcribe your data, and then you start looking through and seeing what things you keep seeing over and over. This is a process that I usually refer to as coding. So as you go through and create codes, and whether they be index codes or maybe as you go through and create memos, those are all data about your data. They aren't necessarily the words exactly in your transcribed data, but maybe they're what that passage means at the time. For example, maybe I'm going to look through and I'm going to read this paragraph, and it's going to talk about how this kid is going to talk about how he was super stressed before a test, so he had to, he kept going to the bathroom, and then he was biting his nails and he felt like crying. And so maybe I'm going to code that. Maybe I'm going to write a memo and I'm going to say, it seems like these are signs of anxiety, that this child was in the process of anxiety. So I put a little memo on it, and then I'm going to code that anxiety. So now every time I see something that looks to me like anxiety, I'll highlight it and code it as anxiety. And then of course I'm going to make a code book and say anxiety are signs and symptoms associated with, the code anxiety means signs and symptoms associated with feelings of anxiety, including blah, blah, blah. Maybe I'll make a little brief list of what I would attribute to anxiety. That is all metadata that I'm creating. I'm looking at what people said, I'm looking at what I saw in my observation, and I am creating metadata in the form of codes and memos that will help me in my analysis. So conceptual labels and index codes. I was just talking about creating codes. So data is consolidated from a number of sources, and we're going to transcribe it. I already said that. And then what happens when you're doing qualitative, and this is my personal preference, but whenever you're doing qualitative study, no matter how you're doing it, there's going to be a system that you develop to help you go through. And what you're doing is, okay, so you transcribe the data, and you're going to do what's called active reading, where you go through and try to find meaning in what they're saying. So you're doing active reading. How you set up your transcription and how you deal with coding is going to be unique to you. We all have these different ways of doing things. For example, I remember when I first started teaching, I was teaching class with Dr. Stanton, and she's not here anymore, so I'm not sure if you guys know her. But she was always the person that put tabs in her books, so she knew where certain places where that she would want to re-reference. And when I say she put tabs in her books, I'm not talking about one or two. I'm talking about like her books. If you looked down like the binding of her book, it was just littered with tabs, like 100 of them. So I remember the first week of class, she would have everybody bring in their APA manual, and she would go through and make us all tab the APA manual. And while I think that that's helpful for some people, and that was her style, I have never tabbed a book in my life, so that's not my style. And after that class, when I did that with her as a co-teacher, I never had students do that after that again, because I think that that's a personal preference. If you want to tab it or not, that's up to you. You know, I'm not going to force you to tab it, and I'll tell students if you want to tab your book, and if that works for you, then go ahead and do it. But that's how qualitative is too. Whereas she's a tabber and I'm not a tabber, maybe I do some things that she doesn't do. I tend to, when I'm doing qualitative research, in my transcription, what I do is I only transcribe down half of the sheet of paper. So if this was I could probably pull out an example, but if this was the paper that I was transcribing on, it would be typed transcription. I don't transcribe by hand, nobody does that. But I would only transcribe about this far across. Why? Because if I only transcribe on half the piece of paper, then that leaves the other half available to me to code on. I don't like transcription that runs all the way across, because I don't want to only be able to code in this tiny little margin over here. I need more space. So I tend to I actually go a little bit farther than halfway, but I transcribe, I close out the margins on my transcription so that they're only, 4.5 or 5 inches wide. And that gives me a nice big wide margin on the right to code on. I also tend to, sometimes I use highlighters to do it. I'll start highlighting in text. So anytime I saw, say I was back on that kind of code that was emerging of anxiety, every time I saw something that would indicate anxiety, I'd make that yellow. So I'd go through and highlight all the, everything I could find about that was, I'd do it yellow. And then maybe I'd find a code that was something about improved teacher performance. I don't know, I'm making stuff up. So then I'd go through and I'd highlight that all blue and make them all blue. So different people code in different ways. As long as you have a code book available so you know what that coding means, then that's completely up to you. But, all right, so we're going to look through, we're going to actively read, we're going to make notes, and we're going to start creating memos, they say. First, you're going to, and what I'm doing in that margin, in that giant margin, maybe first I'm going to write a memo, and I'll say, participant is demonstrating signs of what I believe to be anxiety. So I tell myself that this is, these are depicted as blah, blah, blah. And then I make the code of anxiety, and then I go through and code it. So I start out with a memo and go into codes. Some people don't write a lot of memos, they go straight to coding. Like I said, it's all, anytime you do any of this kind of stuff, it's really personal preference and style. So I can't harp at you for how you do this, because it's unique to every single researcher how they decide to, transcription is always transcription. It's always verbatim, so you can't skip out words. It always has the the ah, the pause, the nervous laughter. Those are all written in always. That's not unique from person to person. So transcripted data isn't unique. That will always be the same. It's always verbatim and always includes any laughs, pauses, those types of things. Those are always written in. What is unique to each person is how you're going to go about doing your coding, your style of coding. If you want to highlight, if you want to underline, if you want to write the words, if you want to write complete sentences, if you want, different people do different things. So, All right, so you're actively reading, and you're going to start tagging short segments of the text. So, and then as you go on and you read more, first of all, let me back up just a little bit. So now we've transcribed all our data, and if you're like me, it's on, half of the sheet of paper. First thing you're going to do before you do anything else is read through from top to bottom the whole thing. All of your transcribed data, you read it from top to bottom without coding. You just read through it for understanding. Then once you've read through it fully, then you start, because if you start coding before you read through it all the way, then you're not going to make a lot of sense, because everything you come across in the beginning would be a code, which you have to get kind of a feel for that data. If I read through the data, I haven't really looked at it. I mean, yes, I did the interview, then I transcribed. But as I look through the data, I'll see on my first run through, that looks like anxiety, and I'll be saying this in my head because I'm actively reading. And then as I get far, oh, that looks like anxiety too. Oh, wait, that looks like anxiety. Wow, anxiety keeps appearing. So now when I go through a code, that code makes sense. But if one person at one time said one thing that doesn't repeat itself, or doesn't, it's an anomaly, then maybe I don't want to code that. Because what we don't want to end up in qualitative research is 243 codes. It's crazy. We have to be able to make sense of this data. And what we're going to do is we're going to code, and then those codes are going to come into a bigger category of themes. And in any given study, you don't want more than 5 themes, because then it's getting too big. Your study would be hundreds and hundreds of pages long. We don't want that, so we have to limit how many themes we're going to allow ourselves to have. So we don't want to have a bajillion codes. We want to be more precise, and we can't be precise if we start coding the minute we start reading data. We have to read through everything first and have a baseline understanding, a good kind of wrapping your brain around that data. Then we're going to go through and start coding when we have a better sense of what the data holds for us. All right, so labels are going to evolve over the course of time. And the thing is when you go through and you make labels and codes, you need to keep careful records so that, you might want to know. I will code and recode on one set of data, maybe a couple of times. But I use different colors, different color pens, so that I know, and I make sure that I date the colors so that I know when I did what. But then in order to do a good qualitative study, I might print out the data multiple times so I can keep going through it, because I need to keep track of when things got split up. And trust me when I tell you this, I learned this especially well when I did my study in my group, is that I had gone through and coded a few times and kind of knocked some of my previous codes out. But when I got in the group, I found that my other group mates actually had those codes. And then I was like, wait, I think I had that too. So I had to go back to my previous iteration and see where I had I did have that. See, so that did strike me initially too. So I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to go back into the data and say, yeah, that is where that happened. And maybe I shouldn't have broken it down into this. Maybe I should have kept it how it was before, so you always want to have that option. So you're going to get those labels through the inductive process of active reading. Like I said, we're going to be actively reading this data, looking for things that jump out at us, that we keep hearing over and over again, that speak to whatever the research question was or whatever the research objective is. And then your index codes are going to help you find places where things are in the text. So if I'm coding this as anxiety and I've highlighted everything that's anxiety as yellow, then I can quickly cut through on that to that index code of anxiety and find those passages. And of course, we want to keep a good directory of everything so we know what's what. And I tend to I tend to go back over and code and recode and code and recode, and I kind of keep a running list of what my codes are for my code directory and what I'm thinking. If you get too far away from them, you'll forget maybe what you were thinking. So if I'm going to make a code of anxiety, I'll make a memo of what anxiety meant at the time, and then I'll try to drop it into the code book right away. It's just like when I do my references. I don't wait till the end to make my reference page. I start my reference page as soon as I get my first reference, and then it goes in. And then every time I add a reference into the text, I automatically put it in the reference page. That's just how I write, because I don't want to miss any on the way back. The same thing happens with codes. As soon as I make a code in my text, I put it into my code book, so I know that's in there, and that's what I'm looking for. And if I want to go back, I can just look at my code book and say, oh, well, maybe I want to see happiness. Let me find the passages, and I can see, oh, happiness, I made that pink. I don't know, whatever. So, and happiness is when the students do blah, 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 whatever. So that's how you're going to be coding. And I put up, to help you guys have some kind of understanding of coding, I put up a few, I know I put up a coding memo and a couple of different things that talk more about coding. There are so many different ways to code, so I don't want you to think that what's in this book by, that we're reading the Taylor book, I don't want you to think that that's the only way to code. So I put up some other information about coding just to try to give you a better feel for what coding is. All right, so this is, it's kind of funny how different people do different things, but I actually know people who use the folder method, and so I'm thinking that whoever wrote this chapter likes the folder method, whereby you're taking out your data units that have been coded or put into, like they fit what your memos say. So you make folders for each of your codes, and then whenever you come across pieces of data that fit, you'll cut that, like literally they cut it right out of the transcript and drop, they print out one transcript and they cut those pieces out and put it into the folder. So if you're looking at what's on the screen right now, the physical features that make stigma obvious, that's a passage that was identified in the text, and then they made a folder for it, and now they're going to put everything. So then when they go to talk about their themes, they pull up the folder for each theme that they want to have. And maybe grouping these text passages, maybe those, you might start out with, if you were doing the folder method, you'd have like 10 folders. But maybe you find ways to merge the folders so that so you only end up with 3 themes. So you merge those folders a certain way. So then when you start writing, you write about themes. So you found a theme, and you pull out that folder, and then you can talk about it, and then you can put contextual passages right into your write-up. So, all right. So memos are going to be your notes that you write on the side for explanations for what you're finding. A lot of times memos are, note to self, this means this, and so you write a little note on it. Some people actually do memos with post-it notes. I know people who do memos with post-it notes. So they'll write a little thing on a post-it note, stick it in the data, wherever that may come up. So memos, maybe you're asking a question. Maybe you're defining what's happening. Maybe you're just trying to come to some greater understanding. Memos are things you can look back on. Memos help you develop codes. Memos are things you might look back on with your co-researchers to discuss. So that's how memoing works. And memos could be as easy as they kind of define what's happening, and that helps you create that code right away. Memos could be a bigger question that you have to come back to, but that will also lead to more coding. So it's just another way to break down the information, or to try to come to some understanding of the information that you're seeing, or the data that you're looking at. So think of it as writing a note to yourself. Something in this passage right here is important. Why? That's your memo. And you'll put a little memo in. And usually if you come, like I said, if you come to a part where you say something is important in this data, why, and you write a memo, plan on seeing some code there. So there's an ongoing reciprocal relationship between indexing codes and analytical memos. So they're saying that codes can be hierarchical or reflect relationships noted in the memos. You ask a question. Why do you think these students feel this way about taking tests? And then your code becomes anxiety. So it's all, they all work together. Memoing leads to coding. Sometimes coding can lead to memoing, because you'll code something, you'll say this is anxiety, and then you'll go, oh wait, but this looks like a really textbook definition of stress. So then you write a note that says, consider looking at stress independent of anxiety. So that would be your memo. So sometimes codes lead to memos, sometimes memos lead to codes. It's all what you do to make sense of this data. It's really kind of hard to explain qualitative data analysis to people who haven't done it, but I hope that you're getting a baseline understanding of this. It's not the easiest thing. All right, so quality assurance. We want to make sure that what we're doing is trustworthy. I've talked to you about trustworthiness. We want to make sure that the information is well received to the research community, or to the community of intended audience. It's not going to be well received if we haven't proven that there's a trustworthiness to it, that what we're saying is correct, that we've taken time to verify correctness, or taken time in how we gather data to make sure that it was accurate. So we're going to talk about coding and retrieving and inter-reader reliability. So if we want to make sure that there's quality of information during the qualitative study, we can do the coding and retrieving. So we're going to create that code directory that I told you. In our code directory, we operationalize the terms, each of the codes, so that we know what they mean. And if we have a strong code directory that not only gives the code, but gives a clear operational definition of how we're using that code in this study, that helps to raise our understanding. That also clarifies across if you have different people doing things at different times. So in my group of 4 OT people doing research, we're all coding separate from each other. So we all have our own code books. That way when we sit down and talk to each other, and one person, we'll stick with the same example, one person coded anxiety, and another person labeled stress. And they keep talking about stress, and I keep talking about anxiety. Well, what is your definition of stress? Well, they can go right into their code book. Or I can go into their code book and look and see what they meant by it. And then I say, oh, your operational definition of stress is the same as my operational definition of anxiety. So let's use one term and stick with it. And so then we can correct that. So coding, analyzing, or interpreting the data, which must take place, and we want to be systematic and consistent. And that's important when you're coding. All right, in terms of inter-rater reliability, well, we get that inter-rater reliability by having the different reviewers code independently and then talking about them. So they call it analyze. They say you can analyze it through quantitative statistics for agreements between the two sets of codes. I don't know a lot of qualitative people who do any quantitative. If you're doing a true qualitative study, you're not looking about quantitative. What's going to happen is typically, and maybe, there are a lot of people transitioning from quantitative to qualitative who keep going back into that quantitative vein because they can't help themselves. So they'll, when they're talking about inter-rater reliability for coding, they'll say, the two different people will write their codes and then I'll run stats on it and that will give you the true answer, right? Most often in a true qualitative researcher will have the two different sets of people, each different investigator will go through and code the data on their own. And then what they're going to do is they're going to come back together and they're going to hash it out, the two of them. And that's how they're calling it reconciled through discussion and consensus. Hash it out, fight it out, duke it out. So that's how most qualitative people do it. They don't sit down and throw things into a statistical analysis. It's just not their style. It's not in the qualitative vein. I know the book says that it does that, but the book that we read has a clearly quantitative lean to it. So bear that in mind when you're reading through this stuff. I'm telling you, in qualitative, what they'll do is they'll have multiple researchers. Say, in my group of 4, we all had a transcription. We all went home and coded on our own. And then we all came together and hashed it out. What did you come up with? What did I come up with? Why did you get that? How did you get that? What makes you feel that way? We talked about it. And did I concede in some cases? Yes, of course I did. Everybody does. It's not like my way or the highway. It wasn't. I was the primary author, but it wasn't my way or the highway. It was, okay, let's have a group consensus on this. What does this mean? What did we decide? And that's how we got inter-rater reliability. All right, so the computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, CACDA, is going to be a computerized method for trying to analyze qualitative data. Here's a news flash for you. This is really a way to get your information into the computer. You end up doing a lot of legwork. It doesn't run the analysis for you because it can't. There is no computer unless it had artificial intelligence that could code for you. Could you go through and say, highlight every time you see the word happy? Absolutely, I can do that on my Microsoft Word program now. But it cannot code the data. It cannot. So you actually have to put in what you want to look for, or put in what you want to find. That's how it works. That's why I said we're talking about high tech and these software programs. It's not the miracle cure for people who want to do qualitative but don't quite know how. Because if you don't know how to code, that computer doesn't do it for you. And what the computer ends up doing, which I don't really like in terms of qualitative, is they tend to do word counts for how many times X shows up. In qualitative research, we don't talk about how many times a code shows up. If we keep seeing it over and over again, that tells us that it's important, it's a valuable code. But we don't count, we don't say, well, because it came up 18 times, that makes it valid. We don't ever say that. We would say the theme of anxiety kept emerging in the data, and because it kept emerging in the data, that tells us that it's valuable. That tells us that it has an impact on the participants in some way. That's how we talk in qualitative. We don't talk about how many times something shows up. In these computer-assisted data analysis, they tend to be able to do that for you, give you a number. In your qualitative research, don't think about numbers. That's not what's important. We want to saturate the data, and we talked about saturating the data. When you as a researcher can answer the questions, because you can say what the participant's about to say because you already know it. You've already heard it so many times, you know it's coming. Then you're reaching saturation. So of course we're going to have, and even CACDA will give you, it says high technology data storage and management as opposed to low technology. So even if you're doing a lot of low technology, so if I'm doing a lot of low technology stuff, so I'm handwriting on my transcripts and I'm using file folders and etc. And I'm going to keep them in a locked filing cabinet. CACDA allows me to do all that with files and folders in a computerized program. I can use a computerized system without using a Cacta program. So I can create, and I do this with all of my studies that I do, I create a folder, and then I'll have all my subfolders in there, and all of my data is in there, and all of my stuff is in there, and however I split it out, and all my analysis is in there. So when I say low tech, it doesn't necessarily mean you're using a filing cabinet and actual folders. It depends on the type of person you are. If you're a computer-oriented person, you can still use the computer and be considered low tech qualitative because you're not using a Cacta kind of program. So that's totally up to you. So here's some things that Cacta can do for you. So it's going to go through each of these text-based searches: codebook development, tagging, retrieval, memoing, theory building, teamwork, multimedia capabilities, and support for mixed methods. So text-based searches, obviously, it can go through all of your transcriptions and find text that you highlight that you want to be found. Like I said, the word happy, or a series of words together it could do. And like I said, they'll say that this will allow you to do word counts or word frequency, but in true qualitative, we're not counting anything, so I don't know what the benefit of that is necessarily. I like the thought of it going through and finding the code words, but a lot of times, if I'm coding something as anxiety, or I'm going to stick with my example, that doesn't mean that in the text they say, I had anxiety. That could mean in the text it said, I cried every night, and I took that to be anxiety. So if it isn't the exact word of the text, the Cacta system isn't going to find it unless you identify what words you want it to find. So you need to think about it that way. What's nice about Cacta is it will develop a code book for you. So, which is nice. So you can put in what your code is, say what the value of it is, and then it will keep a running list of all the codes that you've created in a code book. So it will help you with tagging and retrieval. So it can create your hypertext tags. And like I said, I don't use these systems because I guess I'm a low and a high tech way, yeah. But you can link between one text segment and another within a document, across documents. That would be helpful when we're writing things up, because then you could pull different excerpts, which you have to do in qualitative data, that substantiate your theme, which is nice. So you can use the different ways to retrieve your data. You can use your Boolean connectors, and which we use when you do any kind of data search, and if you're looking at Cinol or whatever you're looking at when you're looking for journal articles, you use Boolean connectors plus and or whatever. Semantic connectors, you can identify retrieval through semantic connectors. So whether there's a hierarchical relationship or some kind of relationship between the codes, proximity, whether when they're close together in the text. That's it'll analyze. And you can use the Cacta systems have a memoing, a way to do memoing. So you can do notes and memos, and those will be ordered, sorted, and displayed however you want to display them. I guess you set that up in the system. The computer-oriented system will allow you to do theory building, so it allows you to construct the theory as you go along. So you can include original text, you can include codes, memos to help support and define the different constructs or concepts in your theory. You can import the data or the metadata, codes, memos, etc., to one another to determine the relationships and how they support the theory. That is really nice to think about. It probably makes it much easier than trying to do it longhand, but either way you can do it without having a Cacta system too. Apparently Cacta facilitates working as a team, because you can all have access from your own computer and track that stuff. But like I said, I can do that on my computer without having a Cactus system, so that's up to you. They have multimedia capabilities, so they'll support graphics, PDFs, HTMLs, web pages, digital video files. They support doing mixed method analyses, and we're going to talk about mixed method analysis in the next lecture, where we talk about combining that quantitative and qualitative. Well, how CACTA, which is computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, they can support mixed methods because some of those computerized programs have quantitative analysis supported in the software. So you can graph and you can export data to the statistical packages as spreadsheets. You can do content analysis, those types of things. Other tools that can facilitate qualitative data analysis, that's QDA. There are some really cool programs that will help with qualitative data analysis that aren't necessarily CACTA. So they have text recognition and scanning software for written information. So you can scan it in and it'll automatically come up on your screen so you can type it. They have audio to text. There's a program called DragonSpeak so that you can talk into your computer and it will transcribe the data for you, which is very nice. So instead of having to type everything, maybe you could just read it all. It depends on how that works out. Sometimes with DragonSpeak, though, it won't hear different voices. So if you are doing an interview, it might not understand the other person fully. So you have to be cautious with those types of things too. But they do have ways to do it. They have transcription machines that slow down the audio so you can type it easier. You can email, text message, online discussion forums, social networking platforms. These all help make it easier to analyze qualitative data. So, or any data for that matter. All right, so what are some qualitative approaches to interpreting and reporting? Well, there are major differences between qualitative and quantitative data analysis. It's a totally different feel. In qualitative data analysis, I care about subjectivity. I care about the subjects, their perceptions, their point of views. In quantitative, I want to be objective, so I don't. That was another thing, my dissertation chair didn't teach me a lot. The first thing he taught me was, you're a smart girl, Amy, you'll figure it out. The second thing he taught me was, I went in and I asked him something, and he said, I didn't ask him. I said, I think blah, blah, blah. That's what it is. I went in and I was talking about my data and I said, I think, and I said something. And he said, I don't care what you think, Amy. Tell me what you know. So those are the two things he taught me. Number one, you're a smart girl, Amy. You'll figure it out. Number two, I don't care what you think, Amy. Tell me what you know. So that's quantitative. They don't care what anybody thinks. Tell us what you know. Tell us what you can prove with facts. So in qualitative, there's a much better feel. And when I think about OT, and I think about how OTs are supposed to be with people, my head says that we are qualitative because I care about people and how they feel, and I want to make them feel better. And each person is different, so I'm supposed to look at them holistically and be client-centered. Well, if I'm client-centered, I'm qualitative. So, that's just something to think about. There's a process for completing qualitative analysis and reporting qualitative data, and that is going to help you figure out how to disseminate. So, the important thing for qualitative is they want to preserve the original format of the data. We want the readers of qualitative information to feel the perspective of the participants. We do that by being honest to what they said. We don't change their words to make them grammatically correct. We add context to make sure the reader is aware of how, when, why these things are being said. We are trying to have people experience what the participants experience. So, like I said, we have them look at individuals' patterns or common expressions of people's perceptions and understanding of the world. We don't change their language. We let the people speak for themselves. What the meanings are that they attach to aspects of the settings in which they live, the behaviors that they engage in, why they think particular things, ways in which people account for or come to their particular actions, their methods for organizing their day-to-day situations. In qualitative, we want to represent that to the reader. We want to represent authentically what the participant experiences. In order to be authentic, and that's a big qualitative word, authenticity, authentic. In order to be authentic, then we have to keep it in the spirit and in the context and in the flavor that it was given to us. So we don't ever, and I'm a grammar freak. When you are doing writings for me, I want the grammar to be right. If it's not, I'm going to correct you. When my kids speak to me, I want their spoken word to be accurate and correct, and I correct them. And now my kids do it to other people, I've noticed. But in a qualitative study, you don't do that, because you're going to use actual passages that the participants say to you. And sometimes it is hard, but you put it in their exact words. You do not change it. We know that qualitative is inductive, so it allows research findings to emerge from the raw data that are collected without the restraints imposed by stricter methodologies, also known as quantitative methods, that are driven from pre-established theories. So, a person doing qualitative is concerned with the identification of key themes and findings, but also with epistemology or what counts as knowledge. So what are the goals of description and explanation? Well, not like quantitative research. We are not attempting to create findings that we can generalize, and that's a big thing that students struggle with, generalizability. I'm going to make you very sad right now. Qualitative studies cannot be generalized. So if any of you says that these findings can be generalized to the population, I'm going to call you a liar and tell you you're done. I wouldn't do that. I would tell you that you're incorrect, because you cannot generalize qualitative findings to a population. Qualitative findings only sit with the sample that they're derived from. So it is an in-depth perspective of a particular sample. If we want to be able to generalize to the population, then we need to take our findings from the qualitative study and do a big old-fashioned quantitative study, based off of our findings from the qualitative. And that will give us something that we can generalize if we get the sample properly. I've said this 1,000 times. I think I've sent text messages to at least 25 of you saying, use thick description, thick description, thick description. I can't say that enough, thick description. What is thick description? If you are truly using thick description, I should be able to feel it, see it, smell it, taste it, know it, all in my mind while I'm reading your paper. I should feel like I'm there. The entire experience, I should feel it. I should know it. I should feel like I'm there. Think of it in terms of a fiction novel. A good fiction writer always uses thick description, because if they don't use thick description, then you can't become attached to the characters. So think of yourself as now granted we aren't writing in fiction, we're writing nonfiction, but think of yourself as being a really good fiction author where you have to really describe everything down to a T so that your reader has an understanding. That's thick description. So outcomes depend on recruiting the most informative people possible, and that's different from quantitative, because in quantitative we want homogeneous. We want everybody to be the same. We don't want so we want to um, eliminate people that are not homogeneous. We want, in quantitative, we want to eliminate those people because they're going to skew our sample and make it so we can't generalize. In qualitative, we don't work like that. We want to have people that are going to talk as much as we can get them to talk. So we need talkers. Guess what? The world isn't all talkers. Some people are very quiet and they don't like to talk. They're not good for a qualitative study because they're hard to get the information out of. We want talkers. We want informative talkers. So another thing that's different about quantitative and qualitative is that I talked to, and I'm going to say it again, embrace yourselves, the iterative process of qualitative. Qualitative is iterative. It's that going around in a circle where you gather data, analyze data, change your tool, regather data, analyze data, change your tool, regather data, analyze data, change your tool. Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. That's how the process is in qualitative. In quantitative, it is not that way. Once you establish a tool in quantitative, it does not move an inch, no matter what. You give the same tool to all the people. You do not analyze any data until all data is collected. Big difference between qualitative and quantitative. So, you might be collecting data while you're still gathering a sample in qualitative. You would never do that in quantitative. You will always have your full sample and go. Unless you're doing one of the, okay, so let me take that back. Because maybe you're doing a study where you have to wait for the sample to come into the study because you're doing a study about people with TBI in quantitative. So as each participant comes in, you'll collect data on them as they come into your rehab facility. But that doesn't really count because your sample is established. You know that you need 25 people with TBI that meet these criteria, and anybody who comes to the door that meets those criteria, those are people you're going to gather data from. In qualitative, you might not even know that you need another person. You're gathering along, you go, okay, I'm not saturated. I need at least 2 more people. You gather more data, go back and forth and do that iterative process. Then you get your 2 more people and you re-interview and you go back and you collect data from the old people and you go back and you say, I still need 2 more because I haven't saturated. So that's unique to qualitative. Rigor, flexibility, challenge, and reward. So I'm going to read this. What qualitative researchers select to analyze in this flexible and rigorous process and how they interpret the data can depend on many things. However, there are particular systematic steps to complete a study. So qualitative research, they're saying, is precise, detailed, trustworthy, because the process is precise and detailed and trustworthy, basically. So quantitative researchers like to say that qualitative isn't structured enough and rigorous enough. I would give that right back to them and say that if you don't follow the right processes in qualitative, then you're not trustworthy and nobody's going to read your stuff. It is a rigorous approach to data analysis. It is a time-consuming approach to data analysis, and there are distinctive steps you have to follow to do it right. So don't let anybody tell you that qualitative isn't rigorous or precise. The nice thing about qualitative that quantitative isn't is that qualitative has a certain flexibility to it that allows the researcher to be able to gather insight, modify, gather more insight. And in quantitative, we simply cannot do that. All right, so what's the importance of data processing? Well, data processing, you're going to make those permanent records that get saved. And we're going to count, just like in quantitative, you are, as an American citizen, you're saving it for 3 years on a locked computer, password protected computer. We're beginning that data processing simultaneously with collection, back and forth, iterative process. Wow, I've said iterative a lot. It should be on the final, I would think. Data should be stored and replicated so that the originals are never altered. And I told you about that. You always want to keep it so that you can go back and check. Maybe, like I said before, maybe in my first go through I came up with one code and then they altered over time, but then when I met with my group they said something and I'm like, oh, that was my first code, let me go back to that. So you don't want to ever alter the originals. You want to keep, and if that means that you have to print out 20 transcripts because you coded it so many times, then that means you print out 20 transcripts. So it's just all part of the process. So transcribing is, and I've talked about this already, converting audio information into a written record. Handwritten notes should also be entered into the written record. All of these things are transcribed. They should include, and this is all written down for you, laughs, hesitations, interruptions, emphases on particular words and phrases. You know how people talk. When people talk, they emphasize different things. Like iterative. That should be underlined somehow. And other speech patterns, because the way that we talk means almost as much as what we say. The way that we talk tells you what's important or what's maybe not as important. So that all has to fill in. When people pause in their speech, sometimes it's because they're looking for the words that they want to say. So they want to make sure not to make an error in their language. We want to know that. Why did they pause here? Because this is something important that they wanted to tell us that they had to actually stop and think about. When people laugh nervously, that tells us something. They were nervous about something. They didn't want to tell us this portion. Something here struck a nerve with them. That's something we want to record. That all goes in the transcripts. That is a timely process. So researchers need to expand upon the primary data by keeping informal notes, memos, field journals during data collection. Always field notes. Every qualitative researcher always takes field notes. You are never exempt from field notes. There's not a qualitative study where you go, oh, I don't need field notes for this one. No, you always need field notes, period. So the field notes, you can see they highlight key events during observations or interviews, and they can serve as a check. They can be an emotional outlet for researchers during data collection analysis when they get frustrated. You say, this person really isn't telling me much now. They serve as the first step of data analysis because you're getting your main ideas down quick. So your next steps after accumulating processed data. Well, you can break things down into data units or blocks of information, we'll call them. So a data unit could be a little vignette that they told you in an interview, so you highlight that little vignette. That's one data unit. It could be a paragraph of typed text. It could be a phrase or term that's used over and over and over, and you identify that as being an issue. Those are data units, how you group information together. Those are going to be your data units. So after you accumulate the process data, the blocks of information or the units of information can be compared across individuals or groups of individuals or other units of data, and ultimately you're going to get themes. And I talked about themes in our codes lead to themes, codes and memos together lead to themes, codes, memos, maybe some stuff that you're getting from you're going to code and memo your data units or your blocks. So it's all a way to break down the data, and codes lead, codes lead to themes, and themes are those things that come out of the data that you've learned. So themes are what you report on. You don't report on codes. You don't report on memos. Themes are the granddaddy of all. Themes are where you want to be when this is all said and done. You want, in a journal article, you want 3 to 7 themes that will emerge from the data and that answer your research question or your research objective. All right, so there are 4 steps in the data analysis process, apparently. For step 1, you're going to perform a formal analysis or interpretation of one data source. You don't do this on one quick run through. You're going to read it multiple times. You're going to go through and try to get an understanding of the feelings and the behaviors and what's happening. Then you're going to code it. Maybe throw a few memos in there. You're going to disaggregate the data, breaking the data down into manageable segments and identify or name those segments by code. You're going to perform a formal analysis. So you're going to code for the purpose of explaining or developing an understanding rather than just being descriptive. So now we want to have a deeper understanding. And you're going to look beyond just the words. You're going to look at what happened socially, what the interactions are, what made them do what they did. That's all part of that. That's inscribing the social discourse. You don't want to code everything. Like I said, we don't want to have 500 codes and this is done, because that is too many and too confusing. We want to code what's relevant to the research question. Don't go off track. Try and stick on track. And codes can be used to flag patterns within all the data. All right, so step 2 is going to be select a code of interest for further analysis. So you're going to pick the code based on the source or the question that began the project. I like to pick my codes based on the question. Everything is going to be driven, remember, whether quantitative or qualitative, the research question or research objective drives the study. Go back to that. When you want to pick a code that you're going to do further analysis on, think about your research question or objective, whichever you are doing, and go with that. Pick a code that impacts that research question or can potentially answer it. Now you're going to compare and contrast data sources utilizing that code. So you've got your code, you're going to compare and contrast across other data sources in some kind of triangulation. Maybe you're going to compare across participants in your study. That can help you have an understanding of the code, so that you know what that code means to different participants across the study. Repeat that process over and over and over of comparing and contrasting. Step 4, draw some conclusions. What does this mean? Ask yourself, what am I going to call the theme? Okay, so now you've got this code and you've analyzed it and you've looked at the code across different participants and tried to figure out what it means. You're comparing and contrasting across participants, because guess what? Sometimes in a code, if you label something anxiety, maybe some of your participants have anxiety, but a couple of them actually thrived on it. Maybe there was something positive. It wasn't anxiety, it was excitement. You need to find that out so you can figure out how to explain, if this code is becoming a theme, if this is moving into the area where it's a theme, you need to explain that from all perspectives. So you want to look at what are the variations under the coded theme and how can I explain them? How do the variations matter? Asking yourself, how do I define the nuances I found within it as I looked at different data units and in different data sources? What are examples of commonalities? What are examples of differences? Why did they matter? What is the significance of this theme for my topic? How does this theme answer the research question? How does this theme regarding this research question impact and interact with previous literature on this subject? So what are some organizational strategies? Well, you could standardize scene depictions. You can communicate dialogue and interpersonal exchanges. I tend to I will definitely talk about the context in order to try to standardize the scene. I definitely always communicate dialogue, so I'll always have direct quotations from participants. You can elucidate indigenous meanings with and without verbal data, so you can say that this person acted this way, and that lends credibility to the concept of anxiety impacting their schoolwork because they seemed nervous, fidgety, biting their nails, whatever. You can tell. And then they also said this. And then you're gonna you can develop and analyze your integrative memos to try to put everything together in this theme and make sense of the theme as a whole, as a way to answer your research question. All right, so how do we promote rigor? Having multiple coders, having multiple people look it over, and then duking it out. Performing member checks, like I told you, you're going to ask people, does this make sense to you? Did I interpret this correctly? I'm going to talk to students, and I did a study on students, and I was calling students even after they graduated, and they're like, why are you still calling me? I left UVille. No, you're still talking to me. You can compare your results with prior literature, which is always good to tie things back to what's already out there. You can do self-evaluation and reflections on your findings, and if your coding is good across multiple data sources, so triangulation, that tells us that there's rigor. All right, so then you have to figure out, we're now moving into how to report. So how do you disseminate your findings? First, you have to figure out who your audience is going to be, because if you're talking to researchers want to know about the rigor. They want to know how well the study was structured. So the methods, they're going to be it's important to be more specific with them in those areas, whereas general audience want to know what your findings are. They want to know what the themes are. So if you're going on the Today Show, you want to talk about findings and themes. If you're going to an OT conference, you might want to talk about methodology and rigor. If you're going and you're doing a research, if you're doing a research presentation at an OT conference, you might want to talk a little bit about methodology and rigor. And of course, whether you're talking to the general audiences or the academic research audience, you always talk about the findings in the long run. It's just how much do you have to focus on the methodology. If you're just talking to general audiences, not much. If you're talking to research audiences, then yes, you have to have a stronger focus on your methodology. Make sure you retain voice or authenticity. The informant's own words and voices should be utilized to communicate the themes as much as possible. Authenticity, I talked about this. We want to be authentic. What is heard and thought by the researcher is important and should be closely represented, but we want to make sure we authentically report what the participant is saying, not put it in our own words or make up our own meanings to it. How to report the analysis? Well, a sequence used by Williams and Irurita to describe and elaborate on the data patterns they analyze is an effective format for reporting qualitative analysis. So the format consists of a name or a label for the category, the author's description of the meaning attached to the category, and a quotation from the raw text or original data to elaborate on the meaning of the category and to show the type of text code into the category. So this is how you're going to, this was the format used by Williams and Irurita in 1998 for a study that they did. They say that you name the category, you give the description, that your operational description as the author, and then you give a little chunk of raw data to show people how you got there. Researchers should try to keep the reports of qualitative analysis as simple as possible, meaning very few themes or findings in each report. I said this. Don't put 50 themes in a report. Otherwise, you've lost your audience. Be specific. Get yourself down to, in a regular research article, 3 to 7 is max on your themes, I'd say. Common ways to report data. Well, you might make a poster, you might do an oral presentation, you might do a written report. A written report's going to have an introduction, the topic under study, the research purpose, the relevance, the lit review, any past research on the topic, gaps in literature. Methods section that's going to tell about the sample, data collection, processing procedures, analytic strategies. A findings section, which will tell what your themes are, with numerous examples from the original data, which are your quotes from your participants. A discussion where you summarize the results and implications. We don't generally see tables, charts, graphs in a qualitative report. Strange. And references to past research on the topic. That's it. Qualitative is good and it's very OT. Don't be afraid of it. I'm looking very much forward to looking at your qualitative assignments. Bye for now.